starting this streaming, and we'll do the syncing once we're up. Thank you so much again, man, for being back.
My pleasure.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Yeah, so sales are going
Great.
great, but for some
Yeah.
reason, I'm like my phone isn't ringing much, so figured I'd might as well just keep things going, keep the ball rolling.
Yeah, great. All right, we're live. I'm just gonna do the syncing. And we do the recording here on the Skype. All right. Hello, and welcome to the 51st episode of NEOHUMAN Podcast. I'm Aga Bahari, edagologist on Twitter and Instagram, and you can follow the show on liveinlimbo.com, YouTube, and iTunes. With me, I'm welcoming back Bryan Caplan. Bryan has been with us before. Welcome back to NEOHUMAN, Bryan.
It is great to be here again.
Pleasure to have you. And for those of you who are not familiar with NEOHUMAN, and it's like 51st episode, this is the first that I'm seeing of it. We've been doing 50 episodes, audio only format, and we decided to expand it and add the video streaming, and hopefully we can have participation by the community and ask questions from our guests, and those all the good kind of thing that we can now enjoy by using internet. So Bryan, let's start with your background, the work you've done, and what are you mainly focused on for the people who are not as familiar with your work?
All right, so I'm a professor of economics at George Mason University, and I've done 4 books. I've done The Myth of the Rational Voter, I've done Selfish Reasons to Have More Kids, The Case Against Education, and my new book came out yesterday. That's Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration.
Fantastic. And I'm showing the Amazon link to your book, Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration. You've done this book with Zach Weinersmith. Is that correct? The illustrator?
That is correct. Yes, your readers may know him through his webcomic Saturday Morning Breakfast serial, one of the most important webcomics in the world.
Oh, excellent.
The most popular. Important and popular, really.
So what made you wanting to write about this topic, and could you not find any more divisive of a subject to talk about in this kind of a socio-political climate?
Right. So, I've been blogging about immigration for as long as I've been doing it, and the blogging has given me a chance to read a lot more research about it. I'll say, I was always pro-immigration, but it was only when I really started blogging that I realized how big the stakes were. So when economists just tried to measure how much would humanity gain if anyone on Earth could take a job anywhere, they usually wind up coming with an astronomical figure, something around the order of we could double the GDP of mankind, double the production of mankind if anyone could take a job anywhere. And again, really this is a number that seems too good to be true. Although it comes down to this: when you let one more person into another country, their gains are enormous. And their gains are enormous because they're so much more productive in the country that is receiving them than one that they're leaving behind. And if we just go and multiply that enormous gain by the enormous number of people who want to move, we've got a tremendous win for the human race.
Okay, so the keywords here is could, or it's projected to do that. And I want to get to that. But before getting to that, the title of your book is Open Borders, and then the subtitle is The Science and Ethics of Immigration. I want to clarify here, how would you differentiate between immigration and open borders? Because I'm not certainly defending open borders policy, and I have my mind open, and this is one of the reasons that I'm excited about this conversation. But I'm an immigrant here in the US, and I was a refugee in Canada. So how would you differentiate between the legal immigration, merit-based immigration, and open borders the way that you are describing it in this book?
Right. Well, the simplest way of saying is open borders just says that immigration should be legal. So in a way, you might say open borders gets rid of illegal immigration by making the immigration legal. Unless, of course, the person belongs in jail, in which case they can't even leave the prison cell. But such people aside, in terms of how I would differentiate it, well, saying like every country on Earth has a restrictive immigration policy. So there's no country on Earth that has open borders, but there were many countries that previously did. Right. So before the 1920s, the U.S. had a nearly open borders policy, and almost nobody thinks it was a bad idea at the time. But also almost nobody wants to go back. And what I want to get people to do is to rethink that and say, maybe we had it right the first time and it's the change that's been a mistake.
And by open border, you're talking about lack of any kind of border, or there is a border, but it's being treated as like expressway and highway.
Yeah. So I mean, like open borders, it means that by definition there's still a border, but it's open. So as to whether there's still a check where you have to go and show your papers or not, I mean, to me that's a pretty small detail. It doesn't have much effect upon the argument. But essentially something like it could be like what you have in the EU, where you really can just drive by at full speed. Or again, it could be what the UK currently is with the EU, where anyone who's in the EU is free to come and go, but you do have to show your papers. I mean, to me, that's not really a very important argument or a really important issue. What's important is that people who don't belong in jail are free to live and work in any country that they want.
Well, one of the biggest points of disagreement for people who are against open borders is that without borders, there is no definition for a country or a jurisdiction for that country. But that's not what you're proposing. You're saying that there is border, there is a definition of a country, but immigration, basically, the legal structure for immigration will be minimized to the level that we're just not letting criminals inside the country. Now, how would we be able to differentiate between law-abiding citizens and criminals? That's another challenge by itself.
Right, so that's a perfectly fine question, and one answer is you just take your chances, which of course is what we do within the U.S. So how do we know that there aren't escaped murderers from Maryland coming to Virginia right now? And the answer is we don't, but it would be such a pain in the neck to go and check everybody's papers when they go from Maryland to Virginia that we just let everybody come, and if somebody commits a crime, we deal with it then. So that's one approach, and seems very reasonable to me overall. But again, if you're really worried, or if there's an area where you have actually had like a very serious problem, then fine, you can go and say, all right, you can come in as long as we check your papers and see that you aren't on any list of wanted criminals, right? But again, of course, just like everything else in life, how do you know that a person coming into your store isn't a criminal? Well, you don't. Of course, you know that it's very unusual that would be so. And if the cost of checking is really high, then you just take your chances, which, obviously is not a politically popular answer, but it's what people actually do almost all the time. If you're going on a date, how often do you do a background check to make sure the person doesn't have a criminal record? You could, but almost nobody does because it's just not very convenient, and you lose out on so many gains from meeting people that are not criminals.
But the difference is if someone is coming from, for example, Virginia to Florida, those people are still Americans. They're inside the country. But the argument is that to what end are we allowing people to come inside the United States, especially in the political climate that an entire party, Democratic Party, is now being defined on the basis of policies like Medicare for all, including illegal immigrants who are inside the United States. So what are the limits? What is the ceiling for allowing anybody who wants to come inside the United States? Because we know that with open borders, the route and direction of migration is not going to be mutual. It's not that the same number of people from the United States would go to North Africa and Middle East, for example.
Of course. Right. So, that's, of course, the whole premise for the argument, because the reason why you get these great economic gains from migration is because people go from countries where their productivity is low, as in North Africa, and they go to places where their productivity is high, like in Europe or the United States. So again, that is entirely baked into the argument. In terms of what are the dangers of allowing immigration when there's a welfare state, so I've got a chapter on that. And again, the answer is you really do have to look at the numbers, because for any immigrant, there's going to be taxes that they're paying as well as services that they're using. And in terms of estimates of what those effects are, at least for the current U.S., the National Academy of Science estimate says that the immigrants that we're currently letting in, which includes a lot of low-skilled people, on average, they are still a big fiscal win for Americans. And if you want, we can go into why. Obviously, for something like calculating net fiscal effects of immigration, people are going to tend to only believe the answer that sounds good to them. I try to really go into the highest quality research to see. To me, the question is, should you go and compromise on this principle of free migration just because there's a small number of people that are a net burden? Or should you just say, no, this principle is too important and we should just let people in because on average it's fine and the exceptions are just not that big of a deal?
Yeah, 2 points. One is on the ground of production, that you're saying that more people are coming from less productive countries to more productive countries, but that is being done at the cost of American workers. That is one of the arguments. That
Sure.
people who are coming with low skill and more vulnerable workers who are coming in the United States and illegally, therefore they're not protected by any kind of union laws, they're not protected by any kind of laws whatsoever. They can get a job for $2-3 an hour when an American worker who is supposed to be getting paid $10 an hour or whatever, that person will lose his or her job. And this has been an argument that's been going on for many decades, but especially now it's becoming more sensible because of automation. That it's not only that we have to compete with lowest skilled workers who are coming from other countries, we also have to compete with the process of automation and how businesses, for example, like McDonald's, if you push the $15 an hour, for example, minimum wage, or if you push more regulations on in favor of worker rights, they're just going to automate altogether. They're going to replace one worker and replace them by kiosks.
Right. So, I mean, it's great that you brought in automation because this really is the issue that gets to the heart of economic misunderstanding in the world. So, you say, all right, so there's a lot of automation coming. Suppose that's true. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I say that is clearly a good thing overall. It has been a great thing for the last couple of centuries. It's because of automation that we have dragged ourselves up from the abject misery of earlier centuries into the very high standards of living, high standard of living that we have today. You know, like if you say, well, does every so overall automation has been fantastic. And again, like what I say is, if there's one thing to know about economics, it is this. Just if there's only one lesson to know, it is that the secret of mass consumption is mass production. The reason why countries are rich is because they produce a lot of stuff. Right now, if you say, all right, fine, automation is good overall, but it's not very good for some workers, then we're getting the answer is, well, if a very particular kind of automation for a very particular kind of worker is indeed often bad. So like Uber drivers will be worse off if we come up with driverless cars. But the overall effect of automation for people in general is still very good because most things you don't produce, most things you consume. Now, that's just automation, but a standard thing in economics is to say that trade and technology are basically the same thing. If it's good for human beings in general or for Americans in general that we have a lot of automation, which has raised our living standards by making us or by allowing us to produce a lot more stuff with the same number of people, the same thing goes for trade. Trade is really another way of getting more production out of the same number of people, right? And aren't there some losers? Of course, there's always some losers from any particular kind, but trade in general raises living standards tremendously, which you can see during a war. You get an embargo, and does the embargo help some native workers? Well, it might be good if there's an embargo on your exact product. Like if you're a sugar farmer, you might want there to be an embargo on sugar. But if there's an embargo on everything, then this is terrible for almost everyone in your country because, yes, they can sell what they sell for a higher price, but they also have to pay so much more for a much smaller amount of available goods. So, a good way of understanding this, there's a little story that economists have been telling about trade for a long time, and it really does fit here. And it just says, imagine there's a scientist, and he says that he's come up with a way of turning corn into cars. I'm going to turn corn into cars. And everybody says chemically impossible, there's no way of doing it. And yet the guy goes and he buys some old abandoned factories down by the docks. And lo and behold, corn goes in, cars come out. So everyone says, wow, that scientist has figured out a totally new theory of matter to be able to do that. Until one day, when a journalist sneaks in the factory, he says, wait a second, there's no machines in here, there's just docks. And all the guy does is get ships from Japan with cars, unloads the cars, and then he gets some trucks full of corn and he puts it on the ships, and that's all that he's done. And therefore, it is a lie to say that he knows how to turn corn into cars. And then the guy gets turned to the authorities, and the factory gets shut down. All right, now, of course, the moral of the story is the scientists did have a way of turning corn into cars. It just wasn't a Star Trek transformer machine. Or what's the machine in Star Trek? Is it transform? What is it?
Right.
Replicator machine.
Right.
All right. Rather, he does it through the power of international trade. Right. And what is immigration? Economically, it's trade and labor. right? And like, why do we actually need to have the people rather than just the goods? The answer is the economy is mostly services. So if you can't trade labor, you can't trade more than a small fraction of goods. And by giving up that trade, you are giving up an enormous amount of prosperity, right? So again, like whenever you're thinking about immigration hurting you in the labor market, you should also think about all the ways that it's helping you everywhere else. I mean, for me as a professor, this is really clear because I live in one of the very few professions that almost has open borders already. So, I mean, the reason why there's so many professors with accents is because it's really easy to hire people from anywhere on earth as long as they're a research professor in a university, right? And is this bad for me? Well, it's bad that I have to compete with foreign-born economists, but on the other hand, there's all of the other things that I can buy with my money because we do have that immigration. So I say even there, which is I am particularly harmed by immigration because there's just so much of it in academia, and yet still net effect for me looks like a win.
Right. Well, I personally am completely in favor of automation. That actually is one of the points that I get a lot of heat from because I don't consider myself to be liberal or conservative or anything like that. But there are elements in each side that I agree with. Automation to me is inevitable, and so is some kind of an UBI, for the lack of a better word, that to provide for people who will be left behind in the transition from where we are right now to the kind of utopia-like kind of a world that is being described. But the biggest problem...
So that's great. I mean, like, it's the only thing I disagree with there is that when you really look at the data, automation is not particularly fast right now.
Right.
So, I mean, essentially right now we have a few kinds of highly visible automation, and this is making people think the world is being transformed. But when you go and step back and just measure automation across the entire economy, this is not a rapid time of automation. My colleague Robin Hanson has been doing some new data work on this. But just all the areas that aren't getting automated, which to my mind, and I can see for you too, it's kind of disappointing. But yeah, it's not that it's, like we are not really living in a super high automation time. Actually, things are probably changing faster from like the 20s to the 70s than they are now.
I think it's more sensible now because it hasn't entered socio-political discussion. For example, the Foxconn company or corporation or the plant that Trump campaigned on to build in Wisconsin. Foxconn has already invested $2 billion to automate their factories. So it's not a matter of allowing companies to start their businesses here in the US by giving them tax incentives. Is that if they can automate, it would be much better for them to automate rather than hiring American workers. And I think because of Andrew Yang also, that he's making the argument that, hey, immigrants are not taking over your jobs, machines are taking over your jobs, and therefore we need freedom dividend, all that. So it's been politicized, and it's in the back of the mind of a lot of people. So when someone is talking about open borders, they're saying we already are in this very uncertain kind of times that it's just going to get more and more complex because of all the devices and all the voices that is available to the masses. They can express their opinion, express their feelings about it. So why should we risk with other people coming from other cultures that is not only about economy, it's also about people who are coming from absolute opposite point of culture from the American culture or European culture. They also start expecting their life to carry on the same kind of a culture or trait that it has in their home countries, and that's problematic for people in Western Europe or in America or in Canada, because this is a very divisive kind of a topic.
Right. I mean, to me, what's amazing is that people can be panicking about technological unemployment at a time when the unemployment rate is near its all-time historic low.
Right.
It's 3.5%. So, like if there were any case of the UBI, I would say, how about you wait until we actually have a permanent unemployment problem? Although, I mean, no, there was another time when people were panicking even more, and that was during the Great Depression, because there were a lot of people who were convinced that the technology of the Great Depression was such that human beings would just have 25% unemployment forever. And then history, of course, showed how ridiculously wrong that was. And then, the real problem was just that wages were too high due to some monetary issues during that time. Right. So, human beings love to leap to the conclusion that there's technological unemployment is a huge problem. And again, I mean, it's understandable because it's so easy to see a person being displaced by a machine.
Right.
But the idea that there are other machines that are creating jobs, and the deeper point that human wants are unlimited, so no matter what we have, we'll find something else to do, these are far less appealing points. I mean, imagine just telling people in 1850, we're going to figure out a way that 1% of the population can feed everyone, and how people would have reacted. They would say, well, that's the end of the world then. If only 1% of people can feed everyone, then there'll be no jobs for the other 99%. And if you had said, well, people figure out something else to do instead, people would have understandably been incredulous and said, wait a second, you're telling me that the industry that has absorbed almost all human labor for the last 10,000 years is going to basically disappear as a source of employment, and it's going to be fine. Sure, Professor. And yet that's what really did happen. Now, agriculture basically disappeared as a source of employment, and it's been great because we've just come up with other things to do.
Right. Do you see any kind of chance of unity on any topic, but especially on immigration, in the current socio-political environment and condition in the United States?
Yeah, well, I mean, realistically, I could say there's great unity on not wanting open borders. Right. So this is something Republicans accuse Democrats of, and then Democrats say, no, I never said that. And I think the Democrats are generally being truthful. They don't favor open borders.
So that's a red line. Open borders is a red line.
Yes. Or even anything, how about let's double the amount of legal immigration that we allow? I don't see any Democrats that are pushing that. Maybe there may be some. There's probably some somewhere, but they're not prominent voices. So, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I'd say Democrats and Republicans are united in disagreeing with me to a very large extent. Of course, I wrote this book, Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration, to try to change that. And I'd like to get everybody on board. Of course, I know, Democrats are, quite a bit less hostile to immigration right now than Republicans. But what I say in the book is there's really no reason why this should be an ideological issue. It's something where, no matter where you start, I think the arguments really make a lot of sense. Just for conservatives to think about immigration as a way that people are able to escape from their oppressive societies and get their slice of the American dream. And that seems like that's something that should really appeal to conservatives. It's definitely appealed to Ronald Reagan. So I've talked quite a bit about his shining city on a hill speech, where it sure sounds like he's advocating open borders. He didn't as a push for it when he was actually president, but it is not that this is an ideal that is alien to the conservative philosophy, nor is it an ideal alien to liberal philosophy. In terms of other things that people are going to agree on, of course, there's easy to come up with scenarios that would bring Republicans and Democrats back together. So if there's a war with Russia, then there's almost always been a rally around the flag effect. So that kind of thing. And then there is the deep point that people just don't argue about what they agree on. So, almost no one's talking about, taking farmers' land, which in other countries, this is an issue, and people do argue about it because they disagree. But in the U.S., no one or virtually no one wants to take farmers' land, so it's not on the agenda, not discussed. In terms of just the bitterness that people feel, it seems quite high. Of course, some of that is illusion just because social media gives us more exposure to angry people that previously we would never have known existed. Right? Or previously you might have only remembered that your angry uncle was angry on Thanksgiving. And now, if you're on Facebook, you might see your angry uncle posting angry things every day. And it makes it seem like people are angrier than they used to be. It's more just like angry people are more visible and social media has given them a bunch of bullhorns. But, there are still plenty of people who are apolitical and apathetic. And in fact, that's the norm by far. But apolitical, apathetic people do not get the limelight, and so we don't think about them. But they're there, and they always have been, always will be, and they're very numerous.
Seems like a lot of politicians are also pandering to that acceptance and validation on Twitter, though, because if we want to think of democracy as winning a popularity contest, this is the most quantifiable way that we've ever came across by numbers that is open and available to everyone.
And especially if you're trying to win primaries.
Right.
Because the share of the population that votes in primaries is minuscule. I think it's usually about 10% of people vote in primaries. So the people that vote in primaries, they probably are actually angry. Like your angry uncle that you can't stand at Thanksgiving, he probably votes in the primary. Right. And this means in order to win those primaries, you do at least initially have to appeal to this very angry and ideological audience. to win in the general audience, to win in the general election, you normally will moderate, and this is standard thing that people historically do is you
Right.
moderate, is you go extreme to win the primary, and then you moderate to win the general election. Although, I mean, like how much hypocrisy can people really stomach? It's always a fair question. I mean, like basically what we see is whenever people get in office, democratically, they almost always do a lot less than they said they were going to do. As to how much that shows that they were hypocrites and never meant what they said in the first place, and how much of it is just that in a democracy with a lot of separation of powers, it's just really hard to change things. That's a big question that I don't think has been adequately answered.
Yeah, that trail of hypocrisy seems to be lingering for much longer now than it was maybe in the 90s, because you would lose an election, a bunch of people would be angry at you, but they would just get together, create their own versions of echo chambers and like, well, we're going to own this guy in the next election. Right now, you can talk about it and the moment the other person wins online. Mm-hmm. So it seems like hypocrisies and double standards are not going anywhere. And exactly because of that, I began to see disillusioned people within the left and the right. For example, rights, there is a faction of right that they're not even happy with the kind of immigration stance that mainstream conservatives are taking, that we're fine with legal immigration, we just have to limit it, we build a wall and all that. But those people are saying, no, we're not fine with legal immigration. And we also want to talk about the white culture, white European culture that is being replaced by. So because of the vacuum of power, it seems like there are so many different points of disagreement rather than agreeing on any kind of a productivity or production to make something valid and productive out of it.
Yeah, sure. So if I were skeptical of immigration, I would be very dissatisfied with Trump because he made many extravagant promises about what he was going to do.
Right.
And he has achieved no legislative change on immigration at all. And you might say, well, that's because the Congress won't cooperate with him. But on the other hand, well, that's what they all say. Anytime a president doesn't get what he wants, he can say, "Oh, Congress wasn't on my side. What can I do? Sorry." And then like at minimum, I would like if I were a skeptical of immigration, I would just look at Trump and just say that guy cannot stay on point for more than a couple of days at a time. So if there's an issue that I care about, I want a pit bull. I want someone that latches on and will never let go no matter what, and just keeps repeating and repeating. If I were skeptical of immigration, I would have wanted Trump on the day, the first day's inauguration, to say this is the number one thing I'm going to do. We're going to reduce legal immigration in addition to getting stricter punishments for and enforcement for illegal immigration. And he's tried a few things, but he didn't try that hard, and he gets distracted by their things and their scandals. Right. So if I were looking for a leader, I'd want someone whose hands were so clean he perform surgery with them without washing them again, right, so that he can stay 100% focused on what he's supposed to be doing. Right. And Trump is obviously not that guy.
So it shouldn't come as a surprise if people on right of Trump, or basically what he represents, his policies and his perspective to be, further right of Trump, to begin to emerge in a political arena, who can offer their kind of perspective to this disillusioned groups of between left and the right.
Yeah, I think he probably gets a lot of slack from people that are more anti-immigration than he is, just because he goes out of his way to upset people that they don't like. Right, and in a way, like a lot of what passes for extremism today is more of having great anger against people that disagree with you.
Right.
But people can have great anger over small differences. Right. Just look at almost any feud between two siblings. Say what is that you're angry about each other again? And it's well, it's hard to explain, but God, I hate him so
right.
much.
Well, it's become also personal and emotional. I think that's one of the best way to look at what's happening between Israel and Palestine. I don't want to go into that topic, but I think it's an interesting point that it doesn't matter who started and why it was started. The moment that you kill someone else's brother or try to kill someone else's family, it becomes personal and emotional, very tribal. Sure. And it seems very unproductive when we get to that point.
Absolutely. So, like so many disagreements come down to you started it. And the actual answer to who started it is generally just unanswerable, because what counts as starting it? So, and you can keep going back further and further in history, and I mean, ultimately, the idea that if you could really answer who started it, then this would justify everything that your side has ever done since then. When you think about it, it's ridiculous. Well, couldn't they have started it, but you grossly overreacted, so now you need to go and make amends, even though it was their fault that it got started in the first place? And of course, the emotional reaction is no. Any reaction that I take, no matter how seemingly outrageous, is justified, given that 1,000 years ago somebody did something to somebody.
Right. So some of the proponents of open border policies are coming from the exact same kind of a perspective, that United States and Western Europe have to open their borders to other people because these people are the cause of those people not having as good of a life, and therefore we're responsible to take care of those people. What do you think about that?
Right. So I've actually have yet to meet any person who believes that, and I've been talking about this for a long time. A couple of times I've been on radio interviews where there were some left-wing people who said they favor open borders, but then when I actually said it means that anyone who can live in any country, live and work in any country they want, they said, no, I don't mean that. And then well, what do you mean? It's like, well, we just shouldn't deport people, and I say, so I mean, really, you actually aren't that far from the current system that we have. Right, and for them, like when you say let people come, they say no, we need more foreign aid. And this is where I say, look, the gains that you get from immigration are dwarf even the largest plausible estimate of what foreign aid could be, because foreign aid is redistribution, whereas immigration is trade which increases the wealth of the world. So, like you don't cure poverty with redistribution. That's never been done to any noticeable extent.
Right.
Instead, you solve poverty with increasing productivity. And that's the way almost all poverty has ever been solved. It's by production, not redistribution. Redistribution can do a little bit at the margin, but if you just tried to go and solve poverty in Bangladesh through redistribution, it's just not possible to do. They just don't produce enough stuff to make it happen.
Bryan's book is called Open Borders, the Science and Ethics of Immigration, and it's now available on a variety of digital publishers and digital distributors. Another point that is being raised, and I heard about this a lot during the Syrian migrant crisis, was that why is it that Europe and America and Australia are expected to receive all these migrants when a country like Saudi Arabia is not taking any, considering how Saudi Arabia, and I'm showing that on the screen for people who are watching this broadcast, has a city called Tent City that is equipped with 100,000 air-conditioned tents that can host 3 million people, and they're using it during Hajj ceremony when Muslims go to Saudi Arabia. Yet they didn't take any Syrian migrants, and all the Syrians who are present in Saudi Arabia are temporary workers. So the question is, why is this, that this burden is on the shoulder of Americans and Western European countries, when countries like, for example, Saudi Arabia is not taking anyone, nobody's saying anything, or a country like Japan, they are very openly are saying that we want temporary workers, but there are certain countries that we're getting very limited number of foreign workers from, and everybody's fine with that. What is this difference of looking at the West and the rest of the world?
Yeah, well, Saudi Arabia is a terrible government with terrible policies. So saying, like, why is it that we have to do this when some terrible country won't help? It's like, well, not surprisingly, they're terrible, so they're not going to help. But in terms of the perceived burden, right? To me, when I see refugees, I see someone who temporarily has a problem, but that doesn't mean that this is needs to be any kind of a permanent burden. I mean, of course, like in general, countries are not willing to even take in refugees that have a full sponsor. So, I mean, I think it is more along the lines of, like, we think of them as a burden, but why do they have to be? Why is it they have to be a burden, or why is it you think that in the long run they are? And in Europe, it is more likely that refugees will be a burden because the welfare states are bigger. Although even there, within 10 years, it's very normal for refugees to find work and become self-supporting. In the U.S., we have it's a much better system for getting people working, right? So, I mean, to me, saying like other countries aren't taking them, I would say, well, that's their loss, because human beings are wealth. human beings are productive on average, not absolutely every single one, but there's no reason that people who are in dire straits right now can't become productive members of other societies. So, if no other country's taking them, then you can say, their loss, our gain, right? Of course, the U.S. Has a long history of being a place where we receive refugees, right? And before the 20s, there were many waves of desperate people who fled to the United States and made a new life for themselves. And I see that as a great thing, not just for the refugees themselves, but for the United States. It was a great thing that so many people came to seek refuge here.
Yeah, I don't think a lot of Americans have problem with immigrants and refugees. The problem begins, I think, at the point of sovereignty. That what is the definition of this border and bordered country that we do have? Like, the simplified version of that would be we have walls and doors to protect our house. Why can't we have a functional border around our country? And then another issue, which is more, I think, sensible in the EU, is the sovereignty of independent countries, that they're like, as Italy or as Britain or as Germany or as France, why can't we decide for ourselves rather than the EU centralized structure of authority outside of our independent countries, either EU or UN, make that decision for us?
Right. Well, of course, for EU members, the whole point of the EU is for them to coordinate on some policies, or else there's no point to have the EU.
And that's one of the reasons that there are a lot of disagreements with the EU now across Europe.
Yeah, of course. So like Poland, Hungary say that they're not going to take any refugees. There's definitely part of me that says if I were running the EU, I would just say, Poland, Hungary, look, you agreed to this deal. If you don't agree with it, we're kicking you out. The EU, bizarrely, doesn't actually have an expulsion provision, right? Which, like anytime you form a group, have a way of kicking people out of your group if you don't like what they're doing. That seems like a fairly obvious point. But in any case,
they seem to be doing the exact opposite with Britain.
So but in any case, like the contrast between sovereignty, or conflict between sovereignty and letting refugees. I would say, there's no reason for there to be any conflict between open borders and sovereignty. You can say every country has a perfect right to do whatever it wants, but it should let them in, right? But it should let them in, right? Well, I don't want to let a lot of people move into my house. Why should I let them move into my country? And the answer is because countries are private property. So letting an immigrant into your country doesn't mean that they get free housing. They still have to go and pay someone for the housing. Doesn't mean that they just automatically receive an income. Normally, you've got to get a job in order to do that. Of course, when the welfare state gets bigger, then there are some free things that people get. Although, as I point out in my book, most of the arguments against immigration really come down to are very would also justify limiting reproduction, saying you're just going to let someone have however many babies they want, even though taxpayers have to go and support these babies. Bogus. No, taxpayers should be able to go and control human reproduction because they're on the hook, right? And actually, in the book, I'm arguing with cartoon Milton Friedman about this because he had this idea that you can't have open borders in a welfare state.
Right.
And
I say that it's possible.
Of course, it depends on how the numbers work out.
Right.
So you can imagine a welfare state so extravagantly generous that it would just lead to civil war collapse to let everybody in. The United States is nowhere near there. Right, and the EU is closer, but still, quite far from it being unsustainable because, yes, there are people that sponge off the system without working, but there's a lot more people who'd rather get a job and get the extra income that goes along with that, right? But if you, the question, so can you have a welfare state and free reproduction, right? And I think almost everyone says yes, and well, what about some, Octomom who goes and has 8 kids that she can't support? What about her? And it's well, yeah, that does seem abusive, but do you really want to go and take away the individual decision to have however many kids they want just because one woman on television went and took advantage of it? And to me, that's a lot of what I'm saying is, to put these stories in perspective, step back and look at the overall statistics and see that the principles that sound good are not just wishful thinking. They really can and do work today. Can and could work today as well.
Yeah, I just think that the biggest point of disagreement is that people are feeling that they're losing control. That there is a government, like in the U.S., with a very dysfunctional Congress with less than 20% consistently approval rating, that is bought by a whole bunch of special interests and lobbyists and PACs,
Right.
and people have absolutely no say in it whatsoever, and it's being pushed upon them, and there was nothing they can do.
So I mean, it's a popular perception. I've done a lot of other work on public opinion and government policy. So the idea that that government in democracies ignores the voice of the people is just so wrong. If you actually just make a list of policies and compare it to public opinion, popular stuff, the policies that exist are generally quite popular, and policy changes generally go in the same direction that the public wants. And,
so would you say that what Congress is doing right now, being so focused on impeachment, is what the American people want to happen, rather than infrastructure, China, anything?
The exact day-to-day details are controversial, and so if you want to understand what is the general tendency of government to do what people want, you can't just look at what's being debated today. You've got to look at all the laws in the books and compare them to public opinion on all the issues, and you see that the match is actually quite tight. And then furthermore, if you see what if public opinion changes. So, I mean, definitely you can see is that when the public, there were the key scandals with Trump, which then did lead to a large increase in public support for impeachment, which then leads to impeachment actually impeachment hearings. As for whether the a majority of the public actually does want it, I haven't looked at the numbers. My understanding is actually a majority does favor impeachment now. So, I mean, although you have to put that in perspective, what fraction of the population knows what impeachment legally means?
Yeah, exactly. And what fraction of the population? What fraction of the population
impeachment removes Trump? Impeachment doesn't remove Trump. It starts phase 2 of another legal process.
Well, so it's really not an impeachment because he wasn't voted on, and those polls, a lot of people are saying that it's tainted because if you take 70% of your pool population to be Democrat, they're obviously going to vote more in favor of impeachment.
Yeah, so I mean, normally for any major issue, there's some crummy bias polls, and then there's some serious high quality polls. So I really, like standard ones, like Gallup, ones that are done by major organizations. I think those are quite reliable. Again, of course, there is the problem of maybe people aren't saying what they really think. Right. So, and that seemed to be an issue with the last election, where it seemed like there was a shy Trump effect, and there were actually there are several percent of the population that did support Trump wouldn't admit it, which led to a very surprising result in the election.
Right. Closeted Trump supporters. There are many of them.
Right. But in terms of the tendency to blame everything wrong in the world on special interests, when you really look more closely, this is greatly exaggerated. Even on something like gun control, when people want to blame lack of gun control in the NRA, and they just don't realize that hunting and shooting are two of the most popular American hobbies. So for a lot of people, banning guns is like banning swimming pools.
Yeah, it's also a constitutional right. I'm not blaming special interests and lobbyists. I'm blaming career politicians who depend on being elected and being reelected, and that's all they care about. And there must be a reason that United States in over $22 trillion in national debt. Something must have gone wrong somewhere very horribly.
Well, I mean, I'd say that's probably because they're listening to the public, because the public wants to have lots of spending and low taxes.
So that's just democracy.
That's really the point of my first book, The Myth of the Rational Voter. When you see government doing something that's bad, check to see whether the public favors the bad thing, and if so, you don't need any big fancy story about corruption of the system or politicians aren't listening. Just say, like it's a case of the public wants it and politicians want to win, so they say they're going to do what voters want, and then they generally do it. I mean, I think a lot of what goes on in Washington is that politicians tone down the crazy policy demands of the public, because what the public wants is just not doable. They want like endless spending with no taxes at all,
right? And
that's just not feasible. But if you really listen to the public, they would basically be demanding that you legislate that 1 + 1 = 5, right? And that you can't do that. No matter how much you believe in democracy, you can't make 1 + 1 = 5.
Do you see the competition that is coming from China a viable kind of picture that is being drawn, that we are in direct competition with China, and therefore all of our socio-political consideration have to be determined with that realization and understanding that we are competing with China?
Yeah, I think this is one of the silliest ideas to emerge in the last couple of decades. When it was the Soviet Union, it was a different matter, because the Soviet Union had a large string of satellite countries, another group of closely associated countries, And they had people in every country on earth that really did want to go and turn their countries into another Soviet country. So, like China is nothing like that. There's almost no, has almost no really reliable allies. There's no, it has like no fifth column of people that are dedicated to promoting Chinese interests, or like not much of one. There's almost no effort on the part of China to get other countries to adopt their model. So their military compared to the U.S. is pitiably small, right? So I'd say like in terms of any kind of analogy to the Cold War, it's just it's like 2% as bad as the Cold War. It's just not the kind of thing. It's the kind of basically China is the kind of problem you should hope to have, because if that's your problem, you don't have any really serious problems. And then of course there's this idea that there's economic competition from China, which should worry us. And again, to me, that's just like automation, where overall the fact that there's competition from China is great. It means that there's lots of great cheap stuff that they're going and selling and raising the quality of life for Americans and other people all over the world. So, China does so much more for us now than when it was a desperately poor country ruled by the murderous tyrant Mao Zedong. Back then, they were just eking out a true starvation existence at best if they were not caught in the middle of a horrific famine. And they contributed basically nothing to the world economy. And now China is a very active contributor, and they enrich the rest of the world through their economic output. They have some horrible human rights abuses. So, Hong Kong aside, what's really bad is what they're doing to the Uyghurs and putting a million people in slave labor camps.
Right.
Right. And, this is just the kind of thing where I think, not only the right policy, but the wise policy would be saying, if you don't want those Uyghurs, we want them. Right? Like the people that you think of as human trash that you're just going to put in a slave labor camp and try to, wipe out their culture and their way of life and just turn them into robots. We want those people. Right? I always remember how in 1939 Hitler publicly taunted the Western culture, saying, if you don't like how we're treating the Jews, you can have them. You want them? And no country was very eager. And I think the Prime Minister of Australia said, we currently don't have a race problem and we do not wish to import one. Right, and if it weren't for those immigration restrictions, then the large share of Hitler's victims could have just gotten out of Dodge, which is what they did under the Czars.
Yeah, people usually don't think about these things until it's too late. That's
yes.
human.
Right. Well, there's the writing on the wall. So there are a lot of people. A lot of German Jews wanted to get out when things started getting worse.
Right.
Right, and so. Now, once things get really bad, then you can't go anymore. But just when you see that things seem to be on a very bad trajectory, and then especially if you got some relatives in another country who say things are okay there and will help you get on your feet, that is a really potent prescription for going and rescuing a people that otherwise would be in grave danger. Thinking about the Syrian refugees, I had this old blog post where I was talking about evacuation. And I'm saying, within a country, if you see that there's a hurricane coming from New Orleans, the government tells the people in New Orleans, evacuate, evacuate, evacuate. And what this does is it reduces the damage of the disaster because people get out of harm's way. And yet with refugees, the attitude of the world is, no, stay in your country and hope everything works out. And then if the horrible disaster strikes, then maybe we'll consider taking some refugees. But at that point, the people that have lived through the disaster often no longer have the means of solving their own problem, whereas if they had just been able to go and leave before the disaster struck, they could have landed on their feet.
Yeah, but the problem also is a whole bunch of other people who are taking advantage of some other people's misery in order to enter other countries as economic migrants or whatever you want to call them. That's the reason that a lot of people in the West are like, well, we have no problem with accepting actual refugees and actual immigrants. Our problem is with people who want to come here to gain more money and leech off of the taxpayers here without contributing anything. Not only that, but trying to change our culture and values according to their own perspectives.
Right. So I love economic migrants because that means that it's someone moving from a place where productivity is low to one where it's high. If you want to say welfare migrants, people are just going to a place where the welfare benefits are highest, then it's much easier to understand what the problem is. Although it's also easy to see a much cheaper and more humane solution than saying we don't want you. And that would just be to say, well, there's a waiting period before you can get benefits. You can't just move here and start going welfare.
Right.
You have to wait 5 years or 10 years, or there's $100,000 you have to pay in taxes before you're eligible. And to me, what's striking is just the way that people are so quick to say our welfare state means we can't let them in, rather than to go and do a more targeted reform of the welfare state and say people are coming, if immigrants are coming to abuse it, so let's go and make just a few adjustments to the system in order to get rid of that incentive. Again, which suggests to me that really what people don't want is actually the economic migration itself. They, just even a person that comes and doesn't take a dime of taxpayer money, still people don't want them. And probably a lot of it, like you said, for cultural reasons. To me, the cultural arguments are, again, just greatly exaggerated. And, to what extent can people just not fit into another culture? Can they go and get a job there and take care of themselves and raise their kids there? It's very few people that are so unassimilated that they can't do that, right? And also compared to 100 years ago, there are a lot more of what I call pre-assimilated migrants. So there are many people who have never lived in a Western country who still speak Western languages and are very familiar with what's going on in Western countries. They know about the societies, the economies through entertainment. So, like in 1900, if you get a migrant to the U.S. from rural Sicily, they probably speak no English. They've never seen they've never had electricity. They really are just very different from the country where they're going to. Today, there are over 1 billion fluent English speakers on Earth that are ready to move to English-speaking countries that will take them in, right? And then, furthermore, in terms of assimilation over time, so there's this popular story that today's immigrants aren't assimilating. Here, I do urge people who think this to talk to any immigrant parent and ask them what they think. Right? I've never met an immigrant parent who said, "Oh, my kid is totally on board with with my culture and is not interested in the culture of the country where he's living." Instead, it's much more commonly saying, "My kid won't even speak my language anymore. My grandkids don't know our language. He just doesn't care about his heritage." So that, to me, is a much better picture of what's going on, and sort of like the idea of the unassimilated second-generation migrant. That's something you see on TV because it's scary and because it's weird. But it's not the way things usually work.
Bryan's book called Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration. Let me ask you a few last questions. How would you define United States? How would you define America? Because it seems like a lot of disagreements are about what they call the soul of the country. How would you define America today?
Well, let's see. If you let me do the wishful thinking of America, I'll say it's a beacon of freedom to all the world. Right? I'd say, what we can honestly say, it is, definitely close to the top of the nicest places to live in human history around the world. You can sit around arguing about whether some other place was better, but, U.S. in 2019, almost every human being throughout human history and around the world would have to say, wow, this is fantastic here, right? And, people don't feel that way. Well, probably it's because you spend way too much time reading newspapers and not nearly enough time just looking out your window and just seeing what an incredible world this is. And if you were to, thinking about like other parts of it, say country of immigrants clearly is very descriptive of the U.S. You really just don't have to go far back before almost any American will actually have immigrant ancestors. And sort of the idea that immigrants were all good until my ancestors got here, and then after that they're bad. It's very emotionally appealing, but when you think about it, it is pretty hard to believe.
Last time you were on, we talked briefly about cryptocurrencies. And this is a topic that hasn't gone away and is not going to go away. And I think it's more important than ever to talk about it now, considering how Facebook has introduced their Libra and the advancement of decentralization, whether in finance or governance, through blockchain. How do you see all of that overall, but specifically with respect to Facebook and Libra, and how Facebook can potentially become the largest central bank in history, basically?
Yeah, so I first started hearing about crypto about 10 years ago, and I just thought the people involved were complete fools and didn't know what they're talking about. So that's my mea culpa. I was so wrong. Right, I was probably more wrong about that than almost any other concrete testable issue. Right, so why was I wrong? I mean, part of it is they just managed to get enough momentum going, and that they were able to get over the network problems that you usually have. But the other thing that I didn't see is just being able to use crypto for the black market, which I think really is the fundamental base. That's the fundamental basis for crypto, is that
proof of concept of it.
Yeah, just makes it easy. Like when I've talked about people that use crypto, one common thing is, yeah, well, we use it for illegal transactions, we use it for the dark web, that kind of thing, and that's also kind of it's like the bedrock on which the currency is based, is that it's a way of trading in illegal products, right? So, of course, if you think that laws banning products are generally good, then this is terrible, and you should be worried. On the other hand, if you think the laws banning products are usually bad, this is, well, all right, great, we figured out a way around these stupid laws. Um, in terms of how big it will get, my colleague Tyler Cowan has just said, well, if we go and look at the monetary value of crypto, it's pretty comparable to the monetary value of gold. And gold isn't something that we often buy things with, but a lot of people invested in it as a store of value and just in case the regular system falls apart. So I think that's a pretty reasonable way of thinking about it. It's not something that's ever going to deprive governments of the ability to raise revenue, because they can always raise revenue off of the physically present sector. They can always do property taxes. They can always tax your labor earnings. So it's not going to have like any kind of big effect of bankrupting the welfare state or anything like that. That's pretty silly. But it does mean that people will have a way of doing certain things, whether the government likes it or not. As for Facebook getting in on it, like the network effects still are important. So, like Bitcoin and like the earliest things that really took off, it seems very reasonable to think that they're going to dominate the market for ages to come. Although one standard strategy for getting over network effects is for a really big firm with a fantastic name brand like Facebook to go in guns blazing. So, like if anyone can go and challenge Bitcoin, I'd say that Facebook currency is well positioned to do that. Although still, I would bet on the status quo every time.
Like central banks.
Well, yeah. So, like, I bet on central banks to retain control of the primary money supply, right? And let me go this way. Like we have a lot of experience with central banks that have offered absolutely god awful currencies, like Central Bank of Venezuela right now, just churning out a currency that's becoming worthless just as you hold it. There have been many of these hyperinflations throughout history, and yet a very standard pattern is that all those countries have to do to get their citizens to start using the national currency again is just to get the hyperinflation down under control, and then people come back. So there's something very sticky about it and something very focal about the fact that this is our Argentinian currency. So even when countries dollarize, they'll often de-dollarize once their national currency becomes no longer ridiculous anymore. So that's something to keep in mind, is there just is this big edge for the status quo. And then within the crypto world, big edge for Bitcoin. But again, of course, discount what I say on this because I've been so horribly wrong before. So clearly I don't understand this nearly as well as people that really have made a lot of money on it.
Yeah, and adoption seems to be the key, because any technology really works as well as a society that adopts it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
All right, Bryan, what's next for you, and where can people follow your work and your updates?
Right. So I've started a new book, which is called Poverty, Who to Blame. Immigration is one part of that book, but there's just a lot more going on. So I'm just going to talk about wealth-destroying policies that exist, especially in the third world, but also in rich countries. We have a lot of policies that make life very hard for the poor on purpose. In rich countries, the main kind of policy that fits the description is housing regulation. So there's been quite a bit of research done on why is it so expensive to live in New York and San Francisco, and the answer is quite simple. It is government. Government makes real estate expensive by making it really hard to build, because lots of supply gives you low prices, low supply gives you high prices. All right, and so what is it? There's all kinds of zoning restrictions, limits on the height of buildings. So a lot of research saying that if you would just dial zoning in New York, San Francisco, San Jose down to the normal U.S. level, you would get enormous gains in GDP, something like 20%. You could drastically slash the cost of living in these high-wage areas, creating opportunity for all the people in the U.S. that would like to move to a high-wage area, but right now they're priced out by the rents. Right. So, this is something that governments do. Officially, of course, they're doing it in order to make sure that you maintain quality of life, but doing it at best very thoughtlessly, and I think often it really is quite consciously. We're just going to restrict the supply because we don't want any more people here. Tough luck for them, right? And then I'm also going to talk a lot about the effect of personal behavior on poverty, and there is this well-established body of research saying, look, if you're in a rich country, you can basically avoid poverty with near certainty if you simply finish high school, work full time, and don't have any kids until you get married. Right? Just follow those 3 steps, and that is an almost foolproof formula or recipe for avoiding poverty if you're in a rich country. And so, there's a lot of research around that, and I think that research is basically sound, but there's a lot more that we can say about it. And it also has quite a bit of relevance even for poor countries. Just the extent of behavior that seems highly irresponsible that goes on in poor countries contributes to poverty there. It really is quite distressing when you read that it is common for fathers in areas with bad malaria problems to go and spend a couple dollars a week on alcohol when their kids don't have mosquito nets. Right? And when you say, well, what am I supposed to do? How about you don't drink for a week and buy your kid a mosquito net? It's not that hard, right? But this kind of irresponsible behavior really is a major cause of poverty. And again, it's one that people don't want to talk about. People think of it as blaming the victim. A lot of what I want to talk about in the book is we need to be more open-minded about who the victim really is. The victim could be the children of irresponsible parents. The victim could be taxpayers who are being forced to pay for someone who is perfectly able to take care of themselves but chooses not to. So, or again, the victim could be people who can't afford to buy a house because a bunch of people in San Francisco think that you shouldn't be able to build any house bigger than 2 stories because it obstructs their view, and that's so important to them that they can't bear to have a 3-story building in their neighborhood. So, there's a lot going on here, and I've already done a lot of reading for us. More of this. A lot of what I try to do for all my books is just to read very widely and broadly. I just don't like writing until I feel like I've read anyone that anyone could fairly say I ought to have read. So, the book will probably take years, but I'm a professor, so that's a luxury that I have, is not to rush things,
Right.
and just to say, I'll write when I'm good and ready, and when I feel like my knowledge is sufficient to write, not before then. And then in terms of where people can get my work, so I blog for Econ Log, one word, and then my webpage is bcaplan.com, bcaplan.com. And then, of course, you can get all my books on Amazon or anywhere else online too. Or you can even go to a physical bookstore. Yeah, so we got a special in-store Barnes & Noble promotion where you can get an extra comic drawn by my co-author Zach Wienersmith just for Barnes & Noble customers. So if you already, of course, if you already pre-ordered it, you can still go to Barnes & Noble and buy an extra copy. And let me say this: the only book I've ever written where kids like it. So my 5-year-old is reading over my shoulder, and there's a lot she doesn't understand, but she was still enjoying it. My other things, I like to work for everyone from good graduates or good undergraduates on up to experts. In this book, I feel like everyone from precocious 7-year-olds all the way up to professional immigration researchers can get something out of the book. So I'm really happy about that. And think of the children. Every kid needs one of these for Christmas, or give it for Halloween. You can do that. Not candy. Open borders.
It's certainly a fresh perspective. People don't have to agree with it necessarily, but it's good to be exposed to any kind of different kind of perspective. And your Twitter handle is Bryan_Caplan. I've added
correct
on the screen for our broadcasting throughout the interview. And your book is called Open Borders, The Science and Ethics of Immigration. Allow me to ask you the last question I asked you the first time you were here, but I'm sure that you don't remember it, and that's a good thing. That if you come across an intelligent alien from a different civilization, what would you say is the worst thing humanity has done, and what would you say is our greatest achievement?
All right, greatest achievement of mankind. I think I'm just going to say, modern economic growth, the modern standard of living. Right? If you just compare what the economy of today looks like to the economy of 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 1,000 years ago, what we have done together to make a prosperous planet is just beggars all description. If you told people 100 years ago about the world of today, they would just call you a liar and a fool, right? So say, look at what we've done, right, and how far we've come. That's, like the modern economy. That's what I would say is our greatest achievement. In terms of, like the worst thing that mankind has ever done, I think I'm just going to go with totalitarianism. Right, so like most obviously Marxism-Leninism, Nazi Germany came close, right, and then there were a few historical absolute monarchies that that were in the same vicinity, like the Peruvian socialist dictatorship of pre-Columbian. things like that. So, basically cases where, say, a few evil men have been able to tyrannize over a vast population with the aid of a doctrine of absurd fanatical dogma, right? So that's, I'd say, human beings at their worst, right? And squandering all of the gains of modern economic development and science in order to live in this, like this, really, what I call like a hell state. So, that's what I'd say. But but like most of that's gone. China's going to get better eventually, right? I just know it. I just know it. 100. Give it 100 years. This kind of thing, like the Chinese will be appalled by what their government was doing now, right? It's just too hard to go and keep a lid on things for that long.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bryan. It's great to have you again, and I'm looking forward to have you back. Talk more about your new projects whenever that they're out.
All right, awesome. Yeah, great pleasure being here. All right.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much.
Neo-humanism now. We need it.
Yeah, hopefully we can keep this going. I've been doing it audio only, and the reception was pretty good. And hopefully with this video, we can get community involved and just talk about, exactly how we are defining humanity altogether in this day and age.
Oh, by the way, can I make one last neo-human point for you?
Absolutely.
All right. So one of the intellectually most troubling arguments against immigration is the idea that IQs are very low in poor countries, and you need high IQs to sustain a modern world. So if we go and let in a lot of people from low IQ countries, it's not going to go and rescue them from misery. It's going to bring us down to their level. Now, one main issue with this is, well, wait a second. How do we know that it's their IQ that's causing their problems rather than their problems that are hurting their IQs, right? And there is a lot of work on nature and nurture. I have an earlier book on this, but as I say very clearly in that book, we have a lot of evidence that it doesn't matter that much which family raises you inside of the first world. If you were adopted by another family in the United States, it wouldn't have changed your adult life all that much. But on the other hand, there's almost no data on what happens when someone from a poor country gets moved to a rich country, and how do they develop compared to people back in their home country. Or at least, I didn't know of much at the time that I wrote that book. But anyway, while writing Open Borders, I did go and track down research on what are the effects of international adoption, especially international adoption at birth. And what's totally clear is that international adoption at birth dramatically increases height, weight, and head circumference. Right? So that's totally clear, right? And then furthermore, what about effects on IQ or educational attainment or that kind of thing? So there's been quite a bit of research. What happens to international adoptees in Sweden? And the answer is they do quite a bit less than the Swedish average. All right, and people say, oh man, that's pretty depressing. Even adoption at birth, they aren't as good as regular Swedes. But what I do is I say, well, let's compare them to the average person in their home country. And we see is that if you're adopted at birth, from say Malawi, and you grew up in Sweden, you turn out to have a much higher IQ than the average person in Malawi, much higher academic skills than the average person in Malawi, and this is a great understatement of the likely effects of moving people so they grow up in rich countries on their abilities, because the kids that are growing up in international orphanages probably would not have been average for their countries. They probably would have been way below average for their countries, because they're coming from poor and dysfunctional families. So this means is that the prospects for human improvement are really good right now. If we can just go and move people from very poor countries to tolerably rich countries, we can get a big gain to human intellectual capacity just from a technology that is well within our grasp right now. Never mind all the possibilities of transhumanism and what we could do, and ways to improve people in rich countries. But improving people in rich countries is hard, but improving people in poor countries, it's pretty easy. Just give their parents a green light to move them. And as long as they get here at a young age, it does transform their lives, and it transforms the kind of human being they become in adulthood.
Yeah, adoption is a very good kind of a topic to discuss this kind of thing about. I'm totally in favor of adoption more than having your own kids, basically. There are so many kids in need, from my perspective, in the world. The problem with talking about IQ and all this kind of stuff is that the moment you start even discussing it, one side of the argument just throw racist and xenophobe and all that at you to shut down the conversation. That's a
Yeah. So
huge
actually, this
loss.
this is the main topic where I did have to like to push back against my editor because they were saying maybe we should just cut this, it's just going to upset people. And I said, no, I don't want to write the kind of book that doesn't address the most troubling arguments.
Right.
Like if there's good reason to believe it, if smart, thoughtful people could be worried, I'm going to talk about it. And like what I wind up saying is that actually open borders is going to be great for the IQ of mankind because one important cause of poverty is growing up in the third world. But I can't say that without addressing the arguments and trying to be fair about it.
Right. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Bryan. If you haven't got anything to
Always
add.
a pleasure. Always a pleasure. So where are you physically located, by the way? I probably asked you last time.
Well, last time I was in Toronto. Now I'm in Fort Lauderdale, South Florida.
Oh, wow. Right, wow. I was right next to you actually last week.
Really?
Yeah, I was just staying down at the Westin Fort Lauderdale Beach last week.
Oh, awesome. Man, please let me know next time you're here. I remember you were in Fairfax, which is close to where my girlfriend's parents live. So hopefully we can meet up at some point somewhere.
Yeah, that'd be great. So, I come to Florida any chance I get. It's actually, like, aside from the fact that I don't have a dream job for life in Florida, it's my favorite state.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's very good to live here.
Oh, yeah. Yep, you're lucky. All right, so great talking to you again. Always a pleasure.
You too. Likewise. I'll send you the links when everything is out.
All right, outstanding. Thanks a lot, buddy.
Thank you.
All right, have a good day.
You too, man. Bye-bye.
Bye.
There you have it. We had our first episode of NEOHUMAN broadcasted live on YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, and D-Live. Just very quickly, I'm going to go through some of your chats that I know that you guys have been talking among yourselves. Thank you so much for being here. This is hopefully something I can keep on going, because I was thinking about going back to doing a NEOHUMAN, which is my podcast, and this was the 51st episode of that. So 50 episode I done audio only, and you guys are more than welcome to check it out either on Live in Limbo, that is liveinlimbo.com, or you can also find it on iTunes if you want to listen to previous episodes, including Bryan Caplan's first appearance on NEOHUMAN. I think it was episode 45. Other than that, hopefully I can continue this going and bring more people and get the community more involved. And again, you don't really have to agree or disagree with anything that is being discussed. You can only gain what makes sense to you and apply it towards your own journey. So David Elkins, thank you so much. David enjoyed it. 5318008. Welcome. Meal and chill time now. Meal and chill is to begin not the coming Friday, but the next Friday, which would be, I believe, the November 8th. Well, hopefully we'll be back to just focusing on the community one day in a week. But tomorrow I'll be back at 1 p.m. Eastern Time with the third episode of Beyond Good and Evil. Expatriate, welcome. Linda, welcome to you as well. Great to have all of you. Burnout Rage, welcome as well. I'm just trying to see. Budgie54, my friend, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to have you. Teddy Bastard, welcome back. So nice of you guys for leaving such wonderful and beautiful comments. I really appreciate it. And to those of you who've been watching this on Facebook, I've been broadcasting this for the first time on my personal Facebook page. So I have no idea how did that go. Hopefully that went well. And on Periscope, D-Live, and Twitch. Also, hope you guys enjoyed this conversation and many more to be continued, hopefully. So thanks again, and I'm going to go, and I will talk to you guys tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, and D-Live with the third episode of Beyond Good and Evil. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.